One.
Great.
Hello,
Okay.
everyone. We have Stirling Smith with us, a lifelong trade unionist, a historian of labor movement, and a cooperator from the UK. Hello, Stirling. Thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
So we started chatting with you a little bit, but now we are recording. So can you tell us how you got started, your interest with the labor movement, and then in extension with the cooperative movement?
Sure, yeah. So it goes right back to the time when I was probably still at school. I was very interested in history. And there was a period talking about the 1970s end of the 1960s, beginning of the 1970s, a flourishing period of historical writing in the UK and a real interest in social history. And as part of that social history story, the story of working people, the working class, if you can call it that, or the proletariat, if you want to use a more scientific or Marxist term, although the word proletariat wasn't specifically Marxist to begin with. So this period of interest in what's called labour history, often by historians now. So I was particularly interested in that. And one of the books that was very influential, called The Making of the English Working Class, by a guy called E.P. Thompson, he described how that unique experience, the first time in history really, when people were being forced actually by the enclosures and changes in agriculture, but they were being pushed into the new big industrial towns, cities like Manchester, which suddenly in the space of really a few decades, these new institutions, these factories came into being, powered by often water and then steam, bringing together hundreds and thousands of people with a different kind of relationship with an employer. And previously, these people had been in what we would probably now call the informal economy, working for themselves, with someone who would deliver stuff to them, or they would work in their own homes, handling weavers working in their own homes, were replaced by people working in factories because of the new machinery. So this was historically a pretty unusual situation. And working people responded in all sorts of different ways. They created movements and institutions as a response to this. So a very common institution to be created was sort of self-help societies. And interestingly enough, I'm currently learning Italian just for pleasure. And I'm looking at a text with my Italian tutor about the history of the Italian workers. And they had these societies, Mutuo Soccorso, I think it's said in Italian. I have to check with Anna Biondi Bird in ILO COOP, the pronunciation. But they were this same kind of institution, a bit later than in England, of course, because the Industrial Revolution started a bit later in Italy. So that's one example. Many workers turned to religion. This is a growth of particular forms of Methodism, which is a sort of Protestant group in the UK. And they created things that historians looking back now say, aha, that's the start of our trade unions. At the time, of course, people didn't call them trade unions. They were called probably the Society of something operatives, the Society of Bricklayers, the Society of Masons, these kinds of groups. With the advantage of hindsight, historians will say these were the beginnings of the trade union movement. But at the time, the kind of boundaries between these organizations were much more fluid than they are now, where these institutions have become more institutionalized, I suppose you'd say, much more set with governance rules and so on and so forth. But at that time, the boundaries are much more fluid, and the person to me who exemplifies this is Robert Owen, because Owen was the great inspiration for the cooperative movement. He wrote his books about how you could organize society differently, particularly as a way of dealing with unemployment. Okay, this is the historian alert. This is me being an historian. So we're going to have a little detour into history now for a minute, because of course Robert Owen himself was a factory owner in Scotland, and he ran a model factory where workers were properly treated. There was no child labour. There was a store, a consumer store with fair prices, where people could go and get goods at fair prices. And then in 1815, after the end of the Napoleonic Wars, then he went to visit the powers who were making the treaties at the end of the Napoleonic Wars, and he said there should be international regulation of labour conditions. He was part of what we now see as being one of the very first people to call for what the ILO does now. That's why there's a bust of him in the ILO library. So Owen wrote about how to deal with unemployment, and he did that travelling around, but his books then inspired the first successful, we would say, consumer cooperative model in 1844 in Rochdale, the north of England, not far from where I live. They established the Rochdale Pioneers Equitable Society, and it was a cooperative society. Looking back at it, but it also set out the vision of education, of emancipation for working people, setting up housing, a whole range of activities. And in the 1830s, Owen was the leader of something called the Grand National Consolidated Trade Union, one of the very first, we'd call now general trade unions. It wasn't an industry-based trade union or a skill-based trade union. It covered all sectors, all kinds of workers, and it had, historians aren't sure about this, but it had its sort of at one point nearly 500,000 members or supporters. So here's Robert Owen. He calls for international regulation of labour conditions. He inspires and sets up the cooperative movement, and he's a key leader in the trade union movement. I did write a small biography of him. So this is what I mean about this fluidity of the boundaries between these different kind of movements. And I think, coming right up to date, part of the SYNDICOOP project, which I'm sure we'll talk about, SYNDICOOP was saying, well, what can we do to bring these movements together, the trade union movement and the cooperative movement, which, because of this institutionalization, I'm going to try and, they've started more like this and have become more like this over time. So how do we get them to come back together again?
Crisis may do it.
You asked a simple question. It's a very long and complicated answer.
No, that's great. Thank you. Thank you for that. It would be interesting to, hear about, get a copy of the Robert Owen biography. We'll check it at the ILO library.
There is a copy of the library. I presented it, yeah.
Excellent. You mentioned a little bit your engagement with the ILO. ILO, of course, the International Labour Organization, celebrated the centenary last year. This year, the cooperatives unit at the ILO is celebrating its 100th year anniversary, which is Rochdale Pioneers' 175th.
Yeah, you're probably right, yes.
And a year, I think, and for the National Co-op movement of the UK, you are celebrating 150th. So it's many historical landmark occasions. If you could, we could bring the discussion to the ILO a little bit. Cooperatives at the ILO, not a part of this tripartite structure yet, mentioned in the constitution of the ILO, earlier leaders of the ILO seeing cooperatives a critical element for well-being of workers. And of course, your own personal engagement with the ILO from both the union and the side.
Well, let me talk first of all about the ILO and cooperatives. And I think, we have to remember, of course, that, Albert Thomas, the first Director General, he came from the cooperative movement. He was, I believe, on the executive of the International Cooperative Alliance.
That's right. And
I think his idea, his view was that, the ILO wasn't, I think the phrase he used, correct me if I'm wrong, was, it's not just about the conditions at work, it's the conditions of workers. So I think this is, if I can be a bit critical of the trade union movement as it is today, it's viewing, the trade union movement tends just to see workers as producers and not only, for example, as consumers. And the times when that fruitful relationship between trade unions and cooperatives has been stronger has been when unions have sought to work and organise and help workers as consumers and not just as producers. So I think that's the inspiration behind the cooperatives branch, the idea that, you know, the worker needs protection. They need labour law, we need health and safety law, we need labour inspectors, we need trade unions. But when the worker leaves work and goes home, you know, there's transport involved, there's housing, there's where to buy goods and services, there's where they keep their savings, and all these things are very well organised through cooperatives. So I think this is, and it's still so relevant. If you look at the Singapore example, which I often quote, I mean, Singapore has a very strong cooperative movement, and a big reason for that is because the trade union movement said the workers' dollar needs to go farther. So I believe in Singapore, there's quite a very successful consumer cooperative movement, supported, initiated by the trade unions. So I think that idea is an important element in the history of the ILO, and it's something I think we need to recapture a little bit. I mean, I keep stumbling across these references to cooperatives in ILO instruments. So, for example, if you look at the recommendation on workers' housing, that mentions the idea that it's a good way to organise workers' housing. Okay, so that's the sort of history bit again. If you want to come to my involvement with the ILO, I was for 2 years lucky enough, privileged enough to work for the ILO on a project. I was the chief technical advisor of a project covering South Asia. I was based in the Delhi office in the early 1990s, and that was a trade union education project. I was working particularly with some sectors like plantations, especially tea plantations, with railways. An interesting aside here, the Indian Railways has a very big network of consumer cooperative stores. There's a manual, there's a huge manual, Indian Railways operating manual. There's a whole section of it about how to run these cooperatives. Lots of support from the trade unions, and I'd often go to a factory or a workplace, and attached to it you'd see the consumer cooperative store just for the workers in that enterprise. But to be honest with you, at the time, I was very much narrowly focused on my work, which was supporting the trade unions to develop education and training around occupational safety and health at work. So it wasn't until a few years later when I got involved in the cooperative movement in the UK, and especially the cooperative college, that there was this kind of epiphany, this kind of moment when I discovered that the ILO was also the agency for cooperatives, and there were all those kind of linkages to be made. So that's when I, came to the cooperative branch, and I was a visit to Geneva. And I must have met Mr. Schwetman and Hussein Polat, and we talked about what the cooperative college could do to work with the ILO cooperatives branch, and we developed an education pack around the recommendation, which the college at the time had some money from the UK government to promote cooperatives globally. So we used the funding to do lots of things, including producing that first guide to the recommendation.
Which we have updated recently.
Yes, we've
together with you again
since then. Yeah. So, but from that, I think was a period of collaboration that was for me very, very interesting. We were able to work together on the SYNDICOOP project, which perhaps we need to have a whole detailed discussion around. And we were able to lobby the then government to support the cooperative branch through technical cooperation funding through the Co-op Africa program. So, but there were a number of collaborations and interactions, and in our work in different countries, we promoted the recommendation, and I think we worked quite closely together for a while.
On SYNDICOOP, you developed a training manual, still actually in demand, especially from the trade unions of informal economy workers in Africa. So can you tell us a little bit more about the links between informality, informal workers, and the uses of cooperatives and wider social and solidarity economy issues in facilitating their formalization, their access to services, their improvement of working conditions?
Yeah. And I think it is probably just a coincidence, but it's a nice coincidence. The same year, the International Labour Conference adopts the recommendation on promotion of cooperatives. It adopts this big report on decent work and economy. Yeah. So, in fact, I mentioned all this in the introduction to the Syndicate manual. So I think it is, as I mentioned right at the beginning of this discussion, really, the workers before the Industrial Revolution, if you like, were much more what we now see as part of the informal economy. So it is, and in the trade union movement, there's a huge literature about how do we as trade unions respond to the formal economy, because it's naturally difficult, because what unions, their bread and butter, if you like, is representing workers to the employer and collective bargaining. And you can go to the employer and say, well, these 500 workers together, we want to have a collective bargaining agreement. And if there isn't an employer, as there often isn't for workers in the informal economy, who do you have your collective bargaining with? How do you represent them? So I think, for me, one of the revelations about SYNDICOOP was seeing in practice, and this is the creativity really of working people, creating institutions that might do something like, helping with savings or microcredit or these kinds of things, but actually, who do we need to lobby? Who do we need to talk to? Who do we have bargaining with? So for me, the example I wrote about this, we did also a collection of case studies for SYNDICOOP. The example of the motorcycle taxi drivers in Kigali, the capital of Rwanda, where each worker, if you like, is a classic self-employed informal economy worker. The worker's there with his motorcycle. Somebody comes to him and says, I want to go to such and such a place. They discuss and they agree a price. So, I mean, where is the collective bargaining? In fact, the collective bargaining between that motorcycle taxi driver, workers, cooperative stroke trade union, was with the authorities. And particularly the traffic police, I seem to remember. So where can we as motorcycle taxi drivers apply for our trade? How do we get recognition from the police so the police don't harass us? So that's what the negotiation was about. And that negotiation process was actually very, very helpful in terms of the livelihoods and the security of those workers. So I think that is, as well as those functions, of course, that group did operate as a classic, cooperative. It would help members save up to buy motorcycles, taxi for their work, because the usual model was they would rent it off somebody and have to pay somebody the rent for the motorcycle for the day before they can start earning it. Obviously, if they own the motorcycle themselves, then they're keeping more of the margin. And I think it provided a repair workshop. It provided a training scheme for new entrants into the trade. So it provided a whole range of services for members or potential members, as well as that, if you can call it a collective bargaining function. So I think, each group of workers in the informal economy will have a different set of problems. So that you can't have a template for saying this is how you need to organise a particular group. And it comes back to that definition of a cooperative, isn't it? It meets a particular economic, social, or cultural need of a group of people. So, and sometimes all three. So the Pacific, and that's what you have to identify really when you're supporting a group, is what are those needs that can be met through that cooperative form, and it takes us back to those first kind of basic principles. And the SYNDICOOP example, I think, was that's particular one in Rwanda, but there were other groups, market traders, for example, in Kenya, and they needed certain services, again, to come together to negotiate, but also to provide toilets and water during the day for people trading in the market. A very simple service, but especially for women market traders, absolutely an essential one. So I think the support given by, for example, the Kenyan organisation of trade unions, COTU, to that particular group, because they were actually physically quite close to where the market was very important, because the unions have got that organizational experience to help people, to say, well, this is how you run an organization, this is how you run meetings, this is how you do all these sorts of things. That, I think, is a very invaluable part of the support that trade unions can offer to workers in the informal economy. So, I mean, it comes back to that fluidity, the boundaries between the organizations that I've already referred to. And, because we tend to see things through our Western sort of spectacles, if I can say this. So, I'm British, so I'll put on British spectacles and I'll look at an organisation and say, is this a trade union? Does it do collective bargaining? Does it have shop stewards? And if it does, say, right, fine, it's a trade union. Whereas our German colleagues might look at it through German spectacles and say, is it a works council? Or the Danish would say, is there a folk high school? It's that kind of, so we look at it through how we see, what does a trade union look like in the UK? And it looks now very, very different from what it looked like 200 years ago. So what we look at an organisation now in Africa or in Asia, and it doesn't look like a trade union does to us, but it might look a lot like a trade union looked 200 years ago, if you get my meaning. Sure. So it's about that, recognising that fluidity and that difference and the creativity of working people, whether they're in the formal economy or informal economy. They will create institutions and organisations and movements which serve their needs at that time in that place. The value of, if you like, the idea of cooperation or trading as a reference point is because they have governance standards and they have philosophies behind them. And the philosophy of the cooperative movement is actually the same as the philosophy of the trade union movement. It's that combined together, we can do things that we cannot do on our own. And when I do training for either cooperatives or for trade unions, I have a training game, which is the same for both groups. There's a number of training games I use involving things like lifting tables and walking on planks and stuff. People have been on the training I've done, well, tell you it's a bit kind of lively, you don't get lectures, but it's the same games for trade unions and for cooperatives.
You mentioned a few examples for informal economy workers, both from the history in the UK worker movement and the fluidity between these, what we call today co-op movement, separate from trade union movement. But also of the informal economy today and how the trade unions can reach out to informal economy workers through cooperatives and services. But it's not only the informal economy, right? And, I mean, you work with plantations. How could corporate value to plantation workers or textile workers, if you care to elaborate? a little bit.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, well, it comes back to that Albert Thomas idea of making, supporting workers outside that production role. So if you take the example of Bangladesh, and I worked a lot in Bangladesh in the last 10 years, in obviously supporting workers in the garment industry and supporting sort of social dialogue structures in the Bangladesh law, and a lot of training around that. And it's one of the things that seems very clear from the studies is that whenever the minimum wage is increased in Bangladesh, the prices go up of things that the garment workers need. So transport prices might go up, food prices might go up, certainly rent in their housing goes up. So the benefit to workers is almost immediately wiped out by the increase in prices. So it struck me, and I've written about this, couldn't we support cooperatives to help those garment workers with those kinds of goods and services, setting up a fair price shop based in the factory premises where the workers could get those sorts of basic commodities and foodstuffs that they need. And of course, in an ideal world, we could link those shops to the producer cooperatives in Bangladesh, for example, for milk and other services that are very successful. But the initial point would be, they would be able to bulk buy, they would be able to provide better quality and better prices for workers. Transport would be particularly important given the rates of sexual harassment on transport in Bangladesh. So a safe transport service could be run as a cooperative. Why not? If you go to the tea industry, for example, in India, where I've been studying a lot recently, through historical collective bargaining agreements between the trade unions and the management has to provide subsidized rations to the workers. So paradoxically, the plantation workers are not included in the Indian government's public distribution system, which is a whole, we could spend hours talking about how that works. But in most parts of India, the state governments will provide, through these called ration shops or fair price shops, a range of subsidized commodities, and other things can be obtained as well. So my proposal is that on the plantations, we could establish or help the workers to set up a consumer cooperative store. That would be the front end of the public distribution system. And particularly important now during the COVID-19 lockdown, workers wouldn't have to go off the estate, because currently they have to go off to weekly markets to buy stuff. That's where they get their other commodities from. And if there was a store on the plantation, then they wouldn't need to do that. So it comes back to the idea of the cooperative helping the worker in that role as the consumer. I have raised this with trade union colleagues, and they think, yeah, let's have a look at it. Let's pursue that idea. Let's try and do that. I think it would be. It's certainly. I think as we come out of the lockdown, as we start recovery from the lockdown, whatever that's going to be, from the COVID-19, it's a sort of thing that we should be looking at trying to encourage.
Exactly. I was just thinking how this time of disruption in the way things work, the way world works, climate change, technology, pandemic, how will that change the way we look at collaboration between movements, new models, like in the case of bankruptcies, how some of these businesses could be transitioned to worker ownership through the kind of then management training, financing, and legal facilitation that will be needed for rescuing those businesses for job preservation purposes. Or the use of technology, how then existing co-ops can use it to reach populations, expand their to new populations, but also this whole idea of platform cooperativism. Even informal economy workers can use these online applications to then do some of this negotiation with employers or public authorities. And health, of course, how health sector could be organized. Yes, there's a public sector which has been shrinking, and we've seen how, private provision of health services at a time like this may be quite challenging. So can the health sector be reimagined through cooperative business models? Do you share some thoughts with us how you see this pandemic panning out and its aftermath, medium to short term, with respect to cooperative cooperation, solidarity ideas? And,
yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think the starting point needs to be, we should avoid the era of somehow returning to normal after COVID-19, because the normal wasn't actually that great for many people. So we should take the opportunity to sort of say, well, what are the business models that have, number one, not actually helped during the COVID-19 pandemic? So to take my country as an example, there's been an over-reliance, I would say, on outsourcing in terms of supply chains in general, both for food. We haven't got any food shortages yet, but I don't think the food supply chains are as resilient as people make out. But certainly in terms of simple things like masks, our government has been scouring the world to try to find personal protective equipment, rather than having more secure local supply chains. And I think we're by no means unique in that. So I think the if you like, fundamental discussion needs to take place. What are the more sustainable business models? How do you build more sustainable supply chains? Now, we know that cooperative supply chains are more sustainable just because they take longer term views of things than the short-term business model. Certainly we know that there will be businesses that will have failed during the COVID-19, not because they are operating the market where they can't survive, but because they've had liquidity problems. So the liquidity problems have become solvency problems, and they're out of business, but they've actually got a product or a service which is actually perfectly valid. So the option of converting to a worker-run model is going to be very, very attractive, I think, and useful to look at. So I think it's actually a huge challenge for you, Simil, and the ILO and the branch, the cooperatives unit side, to try and make sure that discussion taking place. The discussion needs to start now, but I guess it's going to be particularly relevant as we come out of things next year. How we do restructure things, and there the role of trade unions is, I think, going to be very, very important, because they need to sort of say, I'm thinking of they say the health service trade unions. Our members were actually exposed to situations where there wasn't enough personal protective equipment because of poor supply chains. What should they be saying about resilient supply chains that can survive the kind of stresses and strains that have taken place during the pandemic? And that's just sort of an example. Right. But there's a lot of cases, and it's happening in this country now as we move out of the first lockdown, where workers are being asked to go back to work before they should, perhaps, before there is enough protection for them. And if they were workers' cooperatives, that wouldn't be happening. Employers are wanting to get people back to work before the safety measures are in place. But a workers-run business, workers' cooperative, wouldn't be in a position to do that, wouldn't be demanding those sorts of sacrifices, really, from the workforce. So I think this is the discussions that need to be happening, really. What is a sustainable model? And all the scientists tell us that this is by no means the last pandemic. There will be more in the future. We just don't know what they are yet. So it's not a situation, that's unique. It will reoccur in 10 years' time. So we need to be better prepared for it by having more sustainable businesses, more sustainable supply chains.
There's also the innovation adaptation factors. We're seeing some of the cooperatives in their response to the immediate emergencies and crises, adapting their production, turning into producing hand sanitizers, like beer co-ops, or the artisanal co-ops turning into producing masks and the like. So there's some of that, I guess, that needs to take place. I'm curious about one thing. You talked about the British classes, so I'm interested to hear, as a historian, about those British classes, because of course the British colonial legacy has had quite a significant influence on how cooperatives pan out, actually, in the common wealth. So I'm going back a bit, just some thoughts on that. I mean, co-op colleges, of course, for instance, there's a very British institution that had then its similar ones set up in countries like Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. If you care to comment on that.
You were very polite, Simone, because you talked about the British influence. It's not always been for the good, I would say. I mean, it's a paradox, because when we used to get visitors coming to the UK from other countries that say, "Oh, what's your cooperative law?" We'd say, "Well, we haven't got a cooperative law in the UK." But there was a model. I think the first one was in either Ceylon, as it then was, Sri Lanka now, and India, were the first cooperative laws, and they were then tended to be the template for other countries, and they have tended to give, in our view, excessive control to registrars of cooperatives as a government official, and led to a tradition of a too close association, perhaps, between cooperatives and the state. And of course, there are other different models, French models, Belgian models, and so on. But I don't know them enough detail to comment. I think, and that's been the great influence, really, of the cooperatives recommendation and the work the branch has been doing on cooperative law and trying to, prize away that hand of state control on cooperatives. But it's interesting. You mentioned the cooperative colleges, and the interesting thing is that in a number of countries, they have developed into universities as part of the public education system, and that's now the route which the UK cooperative college is going down. It is moving towards becoming a university. And I think that's interesting. I mean, you mentioned, the college celebrated its centenary last year. It was set up, again, the same year as the ILO, 1919, as a response, if you like, partly by the cooperative movement to the end of the war and to the ideas of social justice, which the ILO was set up for. But the college was very much, if you like, a movement college, and it was just aimed at training the staff and the other kind of activists of the cooperative societies. And the idea of a university model, I think, which, as I say, was pioneered by our colleagues in Kenya, I think, and in Tanzania, was more and more of, how can I try and put this? It's putting the cooperative into the wider society and bringing the wider society into the cooperative. So people would come to a cooperative university in Kenya or Tanzania, and they weren't there because they were big cooperative supporters or members, but it was an institution offering a good quality education. But as part of that process, of course, they learned about cooperatives. And then to go back into society and what they were doing with that more awareness. And I think that's an interesting way to go. I mean, there is, with any institutions with a long history, the dangers of looking backwards and looking inwards. And you just mentioned innovation and change, and that's certainly been a challenge for some cooperative movements, is that idea about, new forms of cooperatives, new markets, new solutions. So that encouraging innovation in cooperatives, particularly now, but I mean, it's always an issue for cooperatives, but particularly now, in response to this this latest crisis. I think that's a very, very important lesson. And so opening up the cooperative movement to different ideas and to different, if you like, movements and sources. And the same with the trade unions. That's why the dialogue between trade unions and cooperatives are more important now than ever before, because of the need to learn a lot more and to innovate.
On that opening up point, we are seeing more and more the discussion around the wider social and solidarity economy that includes cooperatives, but also other institutions that share similar values, principles, maybe not the same organizational form, from mutuals to associations, foundations. And in the UK, I believe your framework is very much around the social enterprise. I wonder if you'd care to talk about cooperatives and as the Latin tradition uses the social and solidarity economy, and in the Anglophone tradition, the more social enterprise framing.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, it's not an area where I've thought and done a lot. I think, but for me, the cooperative was the original social enterprise, and the danger is if the term social enterprise or social economy becomes so wide as to encompass anything which says we are, an enterprise doing social stuff. So it can be the equivalent of greenwash, if you like. An enterprise can simply say we're doing all these good things. We're using organic food or whatever, or we're giving a percentage of our profits to good causes, and that then says it's part of a social economy. So and of course, there's a long history of enterprises giving part of their profits to good causes. It goes, you don't have to be a social enterprise to do that. So the difference for me is that the cooperative is has those foundational values and the statement of cooperative identity and the governance model. So you've got that to go back to, and sometimes obviously cooperatives drift away from that, but it's there to sort of tug you back, to pull you back. So I think the difficulty is when you try and unpack the definition of the social economy, that it can mean all things to all people. So I'm afraid here, I was just criticizing the cooperatives being conservative and looking backwards, but I do tend a bit in that direction. So I think insofar as the social economy and the solidarity economy has got some kind of rope, some kind of chain that fixes it to standards of governance, that fixes it to a set of values. So it can't be whatever the entrepreneur creates, then that's okay. And it's good if they can draw upon the cooperative movement for that. But in the absence of that kind of foundational set of values and governance, the social economy can go in different directions and can cease to be really useful or valuable. So I prefer to stick to the cooperative model as the kind of gold standard, if you like, of what a social enterprise is.
Okay. You have mentioned a few thoughts around the co-op unit of the ILO, service, branch, department, division,
yes.
different
evolving governance
culminations, yes, different positions. But any words or many messages you would like to share with us with the ILO, the co-op unit?
Well, yeah, of course.
Today and in the future.
Yes. Just to start about the ILO as a whole. The ILO as a whole has had an agreement with the International Cooperative Alliance. So the ILO as a whole is mandated by the constitution to work with cooperatives. So it does not just need to be the task of the particular team that has that name. So I think that's the first thing to say. And I know that ACTRAV, as a unit, does, is conscious of that, and I mean that there are people in ACTRAV who support cooperatives, but it's a wider role than just the particular team at the moment. That's the first point, and I'd like the ILO to look at that and to build on that relationship. In terms of the cooperatives unit, as you are now, team, I mean, greetings to everybody, past and present and future. I think given the resources that you've got, which obviously aren't anything equal to sort of the task, I think the balance between trying to develop the thinking, which we've been discussing, especially in terms of the future period, develop the thinking, develop the dialogue with other movements, and trying to do that. That's one task. So it's about, if you like, creating almost the theoretical intellectual framework for how those sorts of discussions coming out of the pandemic, and using the opportunity, if you like, to raise these sorts of discussions. And that's one track. And the other track, of course, is always, as ever, to support programs in the field where there is a cooperative element. And I mean, an example, we were in Sri Lanka a few years ago, in the north, looking particularly at the credit cooperative structures that they had, savings and credit cooperatives. But we did, come across the excellent work the ILO was doing there as a project, which I think was a social economy project essentially. But interestingly enough, they were working a lot with cooperatives and helping set cooperatives up. And this was creating great value chains, between primary agricultural producers and markets. So it's kind of, you can't just be a unit or a team supporting field projects, and you can't just be a unit or a team doing this interesting discussion stuff. You need to be able to do both, and both need to inform each other. And I think you're doing that. I think that's what you're trying to do. And given the resources, doing a great job. But to come back to the ILO as a whole, its kind of advantage it has as an organisation is it is a normative organisation. There is a standard. It's a very important standard. It isn't a convention, but it's still a very, very important standard. It's a standalone recommendation, and that provides the only global template for how cooperatives should be run. And that's extremely important. And coming back to this theme of our discussion about the relationship with trade unions, what's very important is what it says about cooperatives should not be used to undermine decent work, shouldn't be used to undermine trade unions. Of course, we know there have been issues around that, and there have been some complaints to the governing body structures, supervisory structures. But it is there as a fantastically flexible, very, very relevant instrument. So I would, come back to that as an instrument. And the infinite flexibility and adaptability of the cooperative model that we've seen, there are no-go areas for cooperatives. I'd love to see a major oil company run as a cooperative, or a big airline run as a cooperative, because we could do it. Cooperatives could do it. So it's and that, I think, is the danger. Again, it comes back to seeing things through these sort of spectacles. British people, we tend to just think of consumer cooperatives. Other places, they'll just think of agricultural cooperatives. We need to think broader than that. The recommendation says this: cooperatives can operate in every part of the economy, and that really is the challenge. To try and remember the instrument for the ILO as a whole, not just for the team.
Recommendation 193,
yes,
2002, on promotion of cooperatives.
Yeah, it's a great instrument. Yeah, so and it's a great thing the ILO has got there. Obviously, there are other UN agencies. The FAO, the Agricultural Organization, has supported in the past agricultural cooperatives, which is great. Although I think the team there is smaller than it used to be. And I mean, the WHO might support, cooperatives in the healthcare sector, and there are some very, very interesting examples of cooperatives in the healthcare sector.
We are talking with them.
Yeah, very interesting ones. But I mean, the ILO has that mandate for all cooperatives, and it's the only instrument, as I say, for the cooperative sector as a whole. So that is a very, very it's an important resource, and at the same time, it's an important. That's what I'm looking for. Again, it's a foundational document, really.
Mm. Thank you for this very engaging discussion. We could go on, but I know that you need to probably go, and we will upload this and share this on our website. And thank you so much for your time till we meet again.
Thank you, Somalia, and better, happier times. And I'm sure edit lots of this out. But anyway, whatever is there, look forward to it.
Thanks a lot.